Hello, beloved, and welcome to this third week of our Lenten study entitled On the Mountainside. It's based on Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus, in chapter 6 of Matthew, as we know it, turns to the subject of prayer. And so in chapter 6, verse 1 of Matthew, it says, "Be careful that you don't practice your religion in front of people to draw their attention." And then if you skip down to verse 5, it says, "When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites." So it's interesting that as Jesus went up on the mountainside to teach, his thoughts, his teaching turned to how to pray, and it starts with how not to pray. In the larger context of not doing things to draw attention to yourself or for show, Jesus teaches us how not to pray. So first of all, he says, don't do it for show. Don't do it in terms of being a hypocrite. A hypocrite is wearing a mask. That's the origin of that term. And so he says, don't pray in such a way that draws attention to you. And then he goes on to say, don't heap up empty phrases. In the vernacular, don't babble. Don't just use a lot of words and babbling that are not authentic. So don't do it for show, and don't just heap up empty phrases. In other words, as we learn from Jesus in his prayer pattern, start just with maybe silence and listening, centering yourself in who God is, and then the words will come. You'll be prompted with the words. We have a very wordy culture. So I think one of the ways we learn to pray is to not be so wordy, to start with listening and centering. So Jesus says, don't do it for show. Don't just keep heaping up empty phrases, maybe platitudes or things we learn by rote. So those are things not to do. And then he has two guiding principles. Basically, be brief and be simple. Be brief and be simple. I bet you wished I would do that more in my sermons, the length of my sermons. But brevity is always a good thing. You don't have to go on in just talking to God. It's more of a process of listening. And here's the key. I think what Jesus is teaching us is to be authentic. As my AA friend in seminary said, he was a recovering alcoholic, and he would always talk about getting honest. So at the root of prayer, at the heart of the practice of prayer, as we journey in these prayer paths of Jesus, Jesus is teaching us, just be real, just be authentic before God, because God knows you. God knows you completely. He even knows your need before you ask. What grace! And so don't do it for show. Don't fill your prayers with empty platitudes. Start by centering, and then just be brief, be simple, be authentic. In college, I ran across a book that changed my life. It was titled, "In Your Life, Is It Prayer or Pretense?" And it showed how, actually in the book of Acts, the early church was gathered, and how we fall into the practice in prayer of trying to convince God of our need, to convince God to be God on our terms. So it started with the assumption in prayer. I think this is where Jesus starts and what he's teaching us. Start with how God knows us completely. God knows our heart. He says in the Sermon on the Mount, God knows what we need and what our heart is long before we're aware of it or we ask. And so God is always out ahead of us preparing for good. You hear me say that a lot. That's grace. God is active, God is loving, God is benevolent, and we are beloved. So start there. So pray from that centered place of rest and confidence in God, God's continual loving presence and action in our life. And that will lead us to what Jesus is teaching us, to be authentic, to have a genuine conversation, enjoyment and rest and nurturing in prayer. God is a nurturing God. And so on the mountainside, as Jesus teaches along the prayer paths of prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, he's really teaching us to be real, to get honest, to eliminate pretense from our prayer life and just rest in God. So may we discover, find, experience, and be centered on that gift of grace in prayer that Jesus teaches along the prayer paths that Jesus traveled as he went up on the mountainside to teach. And so again, as we seek guidance, as we seek to learn how to pray, Jesus teaches us what not to do, not for show, not just empty words and piling up phrases and platitudes, but get real, be genuine, be brief, be simple, be authentic, rest and guide, and eliminate pretense. And you will discover the grace of prayer as Jesus knew it and as he taught it. May it be so for us.